Hello everyone, and welcome to my first video about old 8-bit computer games. Now this is something I grew up with, and it's something I'm very interested in, and I'd be interested in sharing it with people and hearing what people have to say. Now, the plan is to go through every game that I ever had growing up. Now that might be a bit ambitious. I think there must be some 100, 150, 200 games. And the rules are, when doing this, I have to still have the game. And luckily, I do mostly still have the games. A lot of them, perhaps I still have the game itself without the packaging. Some, for some reason, I have the packaging without the game. But as long as I have something that I can show on camera and then probably emulate the games to show them, that's fine. We can go ahead. And I plan to go through them more or less in the order that I had them when I was growing up. But there'll be some games that'll be out of sequence. I don't remember exactly what order I had all these games over the 6 years or whatever I had a Commodore 64. So we'll start today with the first game that I ever had growing up, the first video game that I ever owned. Now, if you had a Commodore 64 growing up, or if you're aware of the Commodore 64, generally speaking, the games would come on, if you're from the UK, you probably remember games on cassette. And this was the way that games were generally distributed. You would load them in from cassette on your cassette player. The C64 had a dedicated dataset player, which was a lot better than the for the Spectrum. You had to use a tape player that you plugged in yourself, and the levels were often wrong, and you had to adjust it, and it was quite hard. But the C64, the dedicated dataset player, meant the games generally loaded, although it did take a long time. If you're from America, you'd probably be more used to seeing games on floppy disk. Games were also, there was also a floppy disk drive, the 5 1/4 inch floppy disk like this. And the advantage of the floppy disk was games loaded a lot faster, and also you could have access. It was a lot easier to access the game, to have load in data during when we were playing it, as opposed to the cassette where you had multi-loads, which you would play a bit of the game, then you would have to load the tape, and it was difficult to wind it back. And whereas the disc could go back and forward, it was a lot easier for multi-load games, a lot smoother, it was a lot better. And I did have a disc drive, not at the same time that I first got my Commodore 64, but several years later, I eventually got a disc drive. So I do have some disc games as well as some tape games, or mostly tape games. But for today, I'm not going to look at a disc game or a tape game, because there is a third way, an alternative, and that is the cartridge. The cartridge game. The Commodore 64 did have games on cartridge, and this is one, and it's the very first video game that I ever owned, Jupiter Lander. And my recollection of this is that when I got my computer, this may be wrong, this may be me misremembering some things, but my recollection, when we went to the shop to buy the game, and my mum was buying the computer, there was an offer that you got a tape with 10 games or 20 games or whatever it was on it, and the shop didn't have that in stock, so they said, you can have this instead. And this is how I ended up with Jupiter Lander, which is, let's be honest, it's probably not the best game in the world, but it's my first game, so I always remember it quite fondly. I don't imagine, if you had too many people, the list of the top 10 video games of all time, that Jupiter Lander is going to be at the top of many people's list. But we'll have a look at it anyway. Now, Jupiter Lander the C64 version was released in 1982, and it was programmed by HAL Laboratory, who might be a name that you've heard of. They're a Japanese developer, most famous for producing the Kirby games and the first two Super Smash Bros. Games, and that might seem a bit strange that they produced this very early Commodore 64 game, but there's a bit of a story behind that. Now, HAL Laboratory, when they started out, they did develop some VIC-20 games, which was the predecessor of the Commodore 64, but there's also another machine in the mix here, which is the Commodore Max, which is a very obscure machine. I believe it was only ever really released in Japan, The Commodore Max was like a kind of strange early Commodore 64. It had the same processor, the 6510, had the same video chip, the same sound chip. So it was vaguely compatible. It had a membrane keyboard and it loaded its games on cartridge. And as it was only released in Japan, as you can imagine, HAL Laboratory they did develop quite a number of games for this, cartridge games, but the Max wasn't a big success. You know, it was only ever sold in Japan really, and it was discontinued fairly quickly. But the Commodore 64 did have a cartridge port, and they did give it a Max compatibility mode. So Commodore 64 can run all those games for the Commodore Max, and they've obviously, I believe, repurposed them. And so the cartridge games were generally only, in my recollection, they were only very early in the Commodore 64's life. You really seen them, and they were quite basic games, essentially repurposed Commodore Max games, I would imagine. But it did have a little renaissance at the end of the Commodore 64's life, when Commodore in 1990, for some reason, best known to themselves, released a video game console, which was basically a Commodore 64 without a keyboard, which was the C64GS, and it was a legendary failure, and I believe are quite expensive to get hold of now. But the games that were released for that were a lot more advanced, taking advantage of the cartridge format and doing things with loading and stuff like that. So Last Ninja 3, I think, and was an Outrun game, and there weren't many games really released for it. And one of the problems the C64GS had was that people just ported games that were already existing on the Commodore 64, put them onto a cartridge, and they didn't take into account the fact that the C64GS didn't have a keyboard. So some games you had to press, they were looking for you to press function keys or press the spacebar, and you didn't have it, so they were essentially not very playable. But this one is one of the earlier ones, and it's Jupiter Lander. So when I first got my Commodore 64, when I came down in the morning on my birthday, this was the only game that I had. So have we look at it? Let's have a look at Jupiter Lander. And here it is, Jupiter Lander. Very simple title screen, as you can see, just blocked out, and a very simple instruction screen. No custom font, just done in the C64's system font. Very simple instructions. You just fire your thrusters, your left thruster, your right thruster, and your main thruster to try to land your lander on the pads. It's a lunar lander clone. And if you start the game, you get this nice little tune, which even after, 37 years, I can still remember that little tune. It's one of the more memorable things about the game. If you don't do anything, your craft will just glide gently down and explode, just like that. But what you really want to do is fire your thrusters to try to land on one of the pads. You've got a ×2, a ×5, and a ×10. Obviously, you'll get more points for the more difficult pads. And you can see on the right of the screen there, the little gauge tells you how fast your craft's falling. The idea is to land on the pad with the line in that little yellow zone. It has to be in the yellow zone before you score any points. And if you don't get it in the zone, if you land, it's not in the zone, your craft will just explode. Don't know what that's all about. If you hit very hard, obviously you will just automatically explode. And if you just go straight up the top, out of sky, don't know what that means, but if you boost off the top of the screen, you get that out of sky message. And this is all there really is to the game. You're just trying to land on the pad and get that little gauge in the yellow zone. The more accurate you get it in the centre of that zone, the more points you score. And when you run out of fuel, you can't thrust, and your craft will just crash. And every time you successfully land on a pad, as well as scoring your points, you'll notice that you get a little bit extra fuel. And this really is all there is to the game, is to just go through that loop, try and land on the pads, get more fuel, try again. Every time you crash, obviously you've used fuel in the attempt, and then when you crash you lose a little bit more fuel, and that's really is it. I always thought the craft here, the lander, looked a little bit like a dog. Don't know if you, and that's just me or if anybody else can see that, but I can see 2 eyes, a nose, and that little thruster there looks a bit like a tongue to me. It's just, once I've seen that, I can't unsee it. But obviously it is intended just to be a little lunar lander, although this game's called Jupiter Lander, just to differentiate it from the original lunar lander, but I think it'd be much more difficult to try to land on Jupiter with, it's not really a rocky planet that you would find it easy to land on in a lander like this. And this is really, as I say, all there really is to the game. And it's just essentially a high score challenge. You would keep playing and try and beat your high score. You can land on, obviously the ×2 is the easiest pad. ×5 is a little bit harder, but still quite possible. And then this is the much more tricky, much more difficult pad here. You try to just ease it down into the ×10 to get the big points, and you'll notice that when you just hit into the wall there, you'll notice that when you get close, it will zoom in to give you a better view of your craft lander on the pad. Better fuel again there. And this is Jupiter Lander, that's all there is to it. It's quite an interesting game, a little bit of a one more go feel to it, but it's not the most involved game, and there are probably better games that you could be spending your time playing. So that was Jupiter Lander. As I say, not exactly the best game in the world, but it's actually quite playable. You can spend a wee half hour, an hour, trying to beat your high score, trying to land the craft. It's basically, it's just a lunar lander clone. It's not a very advanced game. It's a single screen game, pretty basic. There's not incredible sound, there's not incredible graphics, but it has something. It has a little bit of playability, and it does what it sets out to do. And as I say, for me personally, this was my very first game, so it's one that I'll always remember. I still play it occasionally, now and then, emulate it, or ideally I would like to get a working C64 and see if this old cartridge still works. But this is something that is part of my history, and I hope you enjoyed hearing about Jupiter Lander, and thanks for watching.